Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webcast, Mainframe Development in a DevOps World, How to Unleash Developer Talent to Transform Your Business. Before we begin, we'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. For an optimal viewing experience, please ensure that you have checked system requirements along with bandwidth considerations. Webinars are bandwidth intensive, so closing any unnecessary browser tabs will help conserve your bandwidth. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your console space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the slide area. Today's presentation consists of slides and screen share. This webcast is using MediaStream for viewing. So upon rendering the demo, your media audio controller player will launch, at which time you will have the ability to customize your view settings. Please note you may need to minimize the player once the screen share is ended to resume viewing the slide presentation in the screen viewer. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the help link located via the question mark widget at the bottom left of your screen, where you will find details about system requirements and frequently asked questions. If you experience a blank screen during the webcast, please try refreshing your browser or pressing F5. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a more complete answer is needed, or if we run out of time, we will reach out directly. Also, notice the Learn More widget. Here, we've added links to a variety of resources, including a copy of today's slide presentation, as well as a link to another upcoming webcast aimed at helping you align your software delivery to your organization's strategic goals, ensuring your teams are focused on the most critical items for business success. The webcast coming up on January 31st will also feature experts from consulting firm Icon and CollabNet version 1. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us shape our products for the future. We encourage everyone to fill out our survey before the end of today's presentation, and by submitting your response, you will automatically be entered to win a $50 American Express gift card. We are extremely pleased to have as our speakers today Compuware product owner Jim Liebert.
Hi.
And product manager Steve Kanza.
Hi, and well, Jim covers most of the presentation today. I'm going to be covering the live demo part.
And with that, I'd now like to welcome and hand things over to Jim.
All right, thanks, Janet, and hello, everyone. On January 3rd of this year, Compuware released our 17th quarter of innovation. So this is the 17th straight quarter we've released some new product into the wild. And why does this matter? That must seem like forever ago. For instance, for someone who's just starting their job now, that's high school ago. Well, we believe that trust is consistency over time. And so we established this consistent cadence of releasing innovation. So both internal in our organization, we trust that we're going to deliver another set of innovation at the first working day of the quarter. And more importantly, externally, our customers can count on the fact that we have more innovation coming at every quarter. And one reason we established that cadence is the fact that things are rapidly changing in today's reality. That, users are making demands on systems that didn't exist a short time ago. And this is almost Darwinian in nature, right? Like, what do you suppose happened to the last bank to offer access to your accounts from your phone? Right? They could very well have gone out of business. So these are high realities, and they shape what's required for our job. So our job is constantly evolving. Our job as IT and as developers is constantly evolving to meet the rapidly changing realities of today. Now, just last week, Compuware was visited by Gene Kim, kind of a guru of DevOps. And I think, frankly, he was skeptical that a traditional mainframe software company could suddenly get so light on its feet and agile. And after his visit, he was nice enough to present at one of our town halls, which is really presenting to our entire company. And he talked about something called engineering excellence. And really that's when you can kind of cut through the noise of the day-to-day work, as shown on kind of the left-hand side here, and reach kind of this level where things that are previously complex are now simple. And programmers that are bored and unchallenged now feel excitement. And probably most important is that programmers are empowered to innovate and to encourage innovation. Now on the left-hand side, some of those, really what you want to do on the left-hand side is keep the good and get rid of the bad there. Kind of like the old, leave the gun, take the cannoli. And really the way this has changed our work is, historically, traditionally, we've siloed the work of a development process into experts, right? Where each expert was responsible for their own little area. So the expert analyst would do the analysis work. The developer would code, the tester would test, and the operations would implement. And this led to some natural frustrations. For one thing, this process was very long. It might take as long as a year for this process to work through the system. So the ideas that you originate on the left-hand side might take a year to realize. And it can be really frustrating in that at each point, that delay causes frustration. And when mistakes occur, which they're going to occur, that's inevitable, the mistakes in this waterfall process have much higher impact because the process is so elongated that often the mistakes aren't revealed until the end. And the other thing that the byproduct of this was often that the ideas were created in a vacuum. So the idea was kind of maintained internally, and so often even the idea wasn't exposed as a bad idea until much too late in the process. And this, in a fast-moving world, this just doesn't work. And this led to frustration at every point along the way. And here it looks like our developer is taking it even worse than the others. So this has impact internally, and it also has impact externally on the business value the organization can deliver. In that if it takes so long to realize what's happening, it can affect the business outcome. And this is just not something that we can work with today. And this idea worked fine for a long time. This paradigm worked fine for a long time, but really it relied on a monolithic organization with mostly inward-facing applications. So if a majority of the applications were used by employees rather than customers, this process seemed to work fine. And really, when you think back, that was the day, right? A travel agent was using the application on your behalf. The bank teller was using the application on your behalf. But that's no longer true, and it revealed that this approach was problematic, and so the next question is, how can we improve it? And really there were 4 waves of innovation, and these are ongoing, that kind of addressed this need. The first is what's known as design thinking. And this was, how can we come up with better ideas? And this is really stressing a creative process that incorporates input from the end user themselves to create ideas that have more value very early in the chain. And then the lean startup approach was, what can we do to take slack out of the system? And more importantly, what can we do to get feedback as soon as possible? So in case the idea is problematic, it gets revealed very early on in the cycle. The next wave of innovation was agile, and this is where we'll spend most of our time here today. how can we speed up the development process so we can get from the idea, which is on the upper left, to the business value, if you think of this as a timeline, to the business value on the far right. And then finally, and most recently, is kind of the DevOps wave of innovation, where how can we get operations involved sooner in this process so the process is seamless as you move through. So, again, we don't suddenly reveal problems at the point of deploy because we're doing constant integration and constant deployment. And this is kind of a view at the organizational level on how the organization can implement change to move from the idea to the business value as rapidly as possible. Now, you can also look at this at much more of the micro level and look at it as how can we do this same type of process improvement at the programmer level. And here, programmers spend their day doing a multitude of things, right? It's easy to think of a developer just spends all day, every day developing, but it's just not the case. But what we want to do is, at the moments when they are developing, how can we speed that process up? And here we kind of broken it down into components. So, they get the assignment, which in today's speak is often referred to as a user story. They do the necessary analysis. They make the necessary changes. They test it, and then they deploy it. And now this, through the magic of PowerPoint, these steps look sequential, but actually they're highly iterative. Like you jump from one to the other, it might be as quick as like 30-second span. You do a 30 seconds of analysis, and then you do a code change, and then you do a quick test, and then maybe you go back to analysis, or maybe you go back and change your code. You're iterating through these steps as rapidly as possible. And then when you finally get a block of code you're happy with, you promote it into the system. And really, this is Topaz's area of expertise. How can we make this experience for the mainframe developer as friction-free as possible, so the tool itself follows along with the workflow? And then we've also spent a lot of energy is once we have that one developer, we build the idealized state for that one developer. How can they share that with the community of developers? Because that's really one of our objectives is, to take that first developer and have their success propagate to the entire team. And so we're really concentrating on what can we do to make Topaz achieve this goal. And we quickly came to the conclusion that we had to bake in some characteristics right into the product itself. So that, and really we broke this down into 4 characteristics that if we could achieve these within the Topaz IDE, this would be the maximum benefit for our developers. And really, we kind of took the Clay Christensen approach here. Clay Christensen is a Harvard Business School professor, and he talks about clearly identifying the job that your widget solves and then work as hard as possible to nail that job. And here, what we're trying to do is to nail the job of the mainframe developer when they're working on development to get from the starting line to the finish line. And really, we broke this down into 4 categories. This one, essential, refers to, are we providing the capabilities necessary to complete the task? And these can run the gamut between kind of minimal, and a good example of that is when you think of traditional ISPF development and the notify capability, you get the notify when you create an interrupt. So you press enter and you get the notify that your job completed. And then you press enter again to clear the notify. Well, this led to some really bad behavior. I'm as guilty as the next person, but you would submit a job and then you would just press enter repeatedly until you got the notify. Well, in Topaz, we recognized that there was this need for the notify, but we implemented it as a pop-up that then fades away. So it doesn't require an interrupt to get the notification, and you don't have to respond to the notification if you don't want. So that's an example of something that's essential in mainframe development, but maybe we can implement it in a way that's a little more friction-free. And then, like I said, it runs a wide gamut. Another thing we discovered is that automated testing is a significant friction point in mainframe development. There is very little automated testing, particularly at the unit testing level. So we came out with a whole product to address that capability, both at the unit testing and the functioning testing level. So you can create automated tests, you can make a quick change and run those tests just as a sanity check that you didn't accidentally break anything with your change. And I should add at this point that testing is not really my area of expertise, but one of my peers, Glenn Everett, just recently, last week I think, came out with a paper where he discussed the 7 types of testing in the DevOps world. And it's really thoughtful, and it's a nice introduction to what's unit testing, what's functional testing, what's regression testing, what's performance testing. It really gives a nice overview of what you can hope to accomplish at each level of testing. And I believe that's available in the Learn More widget that Janet referred to before. And then moving on to this quadrant, the second one we wanted to concentrate on is this productivity/flow. And, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about this, the concept of flow. And that's, you know, periods of high productivity when a programmer can work on code uninterrupted and get into that productivity zone where I think we've all been there where, you know, you lose track of time because you're so honed in on the task at hand. And that's really what we're trying to do with our IDE. Sometimes the IDE has to get out of the way. Let the developer reach this state and don't interrupt. And then what we've also tried to do is introduce flows to encourage reaching that state. The third area that we've talked about, and I've already kind of touched on this, is the community aspect. And this is, you know, once that one programmer has set up the environment to reach the idealized state, how can they share that environment with other developers so they can more quickly get to that state? And really, the concept here is fairly simple, is how can we leverage the work of one Topaz user to benefit all Topaz users? And here, this is really the focus of our most recent quarter, and Steve will touch on that in the demo. And then finally, there's this concept of bridging, and this is the realization that we're really straddling 2 worlds. The first is there's this reservoir of capabilities that have been built within ISPF over the decades of usage. And we're constantly looking on how can we leverage that work without having to redo it. And then conversely, there's a whole universe of constant integration, continuous integration and continuous deployment and analysis code and testing code that exists outside of the universe of the mainframe. In many ways, with ISPF, the mainframe was kind of trapped in amber for a couple decades. And in the meantime, the whole rest of the development community, you know, moved forward in leaps and bounds. For instance, the IDE world was very competitive. There were IDEs that rose to the top, and then they vanished because other IDE came out that was superior. And really, you know, this kind of trapped in amber has left the mainframe development in kind of a funny state in that there's tools that are very mature and can greatly improve productivity, but the mainframe hadn't traditionally interfaced with them. And so we often take this one as mainstreaming the mainframe. So how can we integrate with tools like deployment tools like Zebia Labs or value stream products like CollabNet or even analysis products like Splunk? And so what you'll see with Topaz is that we have integrations with kind of atypical organizations, ones you wouldn't ordinarily expect with the mainframe. And this whole, you know, baking this into the DNA is really our whole objective here. And you know, talking degrees of separation, Steve and I are never more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation from this slide. This is how much we obsess over this slide. And really, Compuware as a collective, when our feet hit the ground in the morning, this is the kind of thing we're working on. What can we do to help your development staff move from the idea to the finished product as rapidly as possible? And then with that, I think one thing we can all agree on at this point in the webcast is that's enough of Jim talking. So what I'd like to do is move on to the demo. And, Steve mentioned he'll be running the demo. He's been kind of gracious here because I'm actually out of the office. And so he's going to, he volunteered to run the whole demo. Now, we've been having some issues, so everybody should have their fingers crossed at this point because this might turn into a little bit of an adventure. But with that, every good adventure starts with a story. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to Steve.
Thanks, Jim. And throughout this demo, I'm going to be showing Topaz Workbench. And there'll be a mix of functionality that's existed in Topaz Workbench for years, but we'll also be highlighting some of the things that we've added throughout the course of the year that touch on the themes that Jim described of things that are essential, the workflow and nailing the job of a developer in a modern era, and also the community aspects. So I have Topaz Workbench open, and as a developer, typically what is going to happen is, as Jim described, we need to work in an agile fashion. We need to be able to incrementally deliver value. So one of the key aspects is, in working in that method, is getting the ideas in, the stories in, and understanding those, and then translating that quickly into working software. So in my role as a developer today, I've been assigned a JIRA, and it's working on a system that I'm not familiar with, but it is something that's critical. And I need to do some work on overhauling how our payment system is factoring in cost of living. So in the story, it's a fairly brief description of what the business wants in being able to incorporate the cost of living factors from a location feed data into the payment system. And some of this work was done leading up to this in another JIRA. So that gives me some breadcrumbs to work off of and start doing that analysis. And a key thing is that it's referencing this group that has worked on this previously, the WePay group within my organization. So coming back into Topaz Workbench, again, I haven't worked on WePay, so I'm not really familiar with it. And what I'm able to do, taking in that community aspect, is we've added in the ability to import content in the Topaz Workbench in a very easy way. And there are really two use cases around this. The first use case would be if someone that's brand new to Topaz Workbench, going through the experience of setting up Topaz Workbench is something where there's a lot of little tasks. And what we want to try to do is automate wherever possible, because the automation and integration aspects of it are key in that modern development experience. So we have two methods for importing content into Topaz Workbench. The first method is we have the ability to use our Compuware Enterprise services as a bit of a cloud repository within your organization. And within that, you can have different profiles set up. So you can see one of the profiles is the WePay application. Another one is some default settings that are useful. And within these profiles, you have things like launch configurations, file aid configurations, the preferences for Eclipse, and projects and working sets. And I'll touch on those in more detail in a minute. So I'm able to share this very easily through CES across the team. For purposes of this demo, I'm going to cover importing something from a zip file that I've shared. So you can see here, I'm going to import that WePay application. And I can see which projects and working sets it contains. So I'll go ahead and import that. And if you saw it happened fairly quickly behind the scenes, I added some projects to my Topaz workbench. And before I get into the working set aspect, I want to touch on this a little bit, touching on some of the enhancements that we've added to projects. So one of the things we heard from users consistently was Host Explorer is great. It's a great ability to see what's out there, but there can be challenges because there's so much information out there. And historically, the way that mainframe data sets have been created, how things are stored, it can be a little bit difficult to find what you need. So what we've added into the projects within the year was the ability to organize things like data within a project, and also have projects for ISPW, so you can see the content of source code, you can see content of data, and also the testing aspects of a project are covered through total test projects. So getting into that workflow aspect, I have within my Project Explorer all the critical items I need to understand an application, understand its data, understand and know how to run that application and test that application. So again, importing the information in is good, but there's still a lot of information in here. Luckily, what I'm also able to do is some of these assets span multiple applications. I want to hone in on the WePay application, and I can do that through a working set. So I'll go ahead and select that working set. And now instead of the universe from Host Explorer refined down to projects, I can refine that down even further to hone in on the specific aspect of the WePay application that I need to change. And so having this focus enables me to have a more tighter control, tighter field of view, be more productive. So I can see here that I have some data files, and here are the new tables that I've been asked to incorporate into my application. So I'll go ahead and look at these tables. You can see here, this is the incentives table. And also, I'm going to go ahead and open up the location information table. And you can see here that I have a zip code and a cost factor. So that gives me a pretty good idea of what I'm dealing with in terms of data. And what I want to be able to do is incorporate matching the zip codes from the incentives table, and you can see there's zip codes here, and matching that back with the location. And to touch on another new aspect that we added within the course of the year is we've added the capability to use Eclipse data tools on the mainframe as well. So I'll switch over to my database development perspective, and I'm able to see, connect to a database, again, see the tables in the structure. But what's really useful here is I know I need to do a join on those tables. And what I can do with the data tools is I can leverage functionality there to create that join. So I'll go ahead into the SQL Query Builder.
Now, one thing I should just interject here is when we implemented data tools, as we talked to customers, one of their qualms about data tools is it required JDBC access to DB2 on the mainframe. and sites were leery about granting that type of access. So our implementation of data tools actually uses our HCI integration. So you build a SQL query inside data tools, it gets sent up to the mainframe through HCI, and then finally executed through FileAid for DB2. So this, and our HCI can be secure, and this just opens the door for, allowing programmers to do this without worrying about, the consequences of JDBC access to the mainframe.
Yeah, and you can see here I'm able to create a join between these two tables, and obviously this is an extremely simple example, but you can see the value of being able to drag and drop discoverable interface, particularly when you get into complex transactions. And I can also go ahead and execute this. So I'll go ahead and run it, and I can see here the results that are returned for my SQL query. So I can understand if I'm matching the data correctly and fine-tune my query to get to the point where I do have a query that is going to work for me. Now, having the query is great. I still need to figure out how do I want to incorporate that into my program. And again, another nice thing that is able to be shared is the Expediter debug configurations. So I know how to run this particular program because someone else has set up that debug configuration and run it before, and I'm able to gain that knowledge. So I can execute through this particular transaction, and I can start to understand the program flow of it. Again, I haven't modified it yet, but it gives me a good understanding of the flow of it and where I need to modify it in order for it to take advantage of the new tables. So I'll go ahead and finish that execution. I can see in my runtime visualizer that, that this particular application is using this demo tab table and reading from some employee files, writing to some report files. And so this demo tab table is something that I'm going to want to update to reference the new incentives table, and then also incorporate in the logic to pull the location data and unify that into the logic of the application. So in the interest of time in a WebEx, I'm not going to actually make all the coding changes, but what I do have, again, is this is the program before my modifications, and I've added that to an assignment in ISPW, referencing the JIRA, and I'm going to go ahead and, again, for purposes of this webcast, I'm going to compare and merge changes that I've already made. So you can see I'm bringing up the compare interface. Here's my program at Dev1. Here's a copy of it that already has all the changes that I need. So I'm just going to go ahead and merge in all those changes. I will save this. Go ahead and exit out of it. And now I'm going to want to recompile this particular program. And once that recompilation is done, I can then start, again, going through that iterative process of making sure that my changes are done correctly and start also testing that through automation. So again, that generate is done successfully. I'm going to go ahead and debug this transaction again. And I will execute through it. And you can see here that I am using these new tables, and my program has gone through a simple execution of it, and it hasn't crashed, it hasn't ab-ended, so that's good, but that's not good enough. We really needed to test this more thoroughly. And one of the things I could do during the debugging of it is I could create a unit test and again, interest of time within the webcast, I've already created that unit test. And I'm going to go ahead and run that unit test. And what the unit test does, and actually before I run it, you can see here that I have different things like data stubs for the different SQL query that I've executed. I have input on my join in the values that I'm getting from my join. So I can start manipulating these to make sure that I've tested that code thoroughly. I can add scenarios, add more test data, and go through that iterative process of testing, running the tests, and looking at feedback such as code coverage in a very automated fashion. So I'm able to iterate through this much faster and do it in a way that ultimately forms some sort of repeatable asset that others can leverage. So you can see here I've gotten the code coverage up to about 59%, maybe not the best code coverage, but in this case, I had no code coverage over this program before, so I'm not going to try to boil the ocean at once. I've made changes to this program. I've made sure I've tested the lines that I've changed to this program, and I have coverage on that. And at that point, I think I'm in a good situation to promote this particular program up through my IMSDBS lifecycle. So I'll go ahead and promote it. And this brings in another key aspect that Jim talked about is automation and integration. So being able to give the developer experience that is modern and something that their colleagues, regardless of the platforms they're working on, are used to these things, and they're things that they want to use. They build excitement. They build energy for the development teams. They give them something to break out of potential boredom that may occur if they're doing the same types of things in the same types of ways that have been done for a very long time in the past. That doesn't necessarily create the type of exciting environment that you want in order to innovate rapidly within your organization. So I've promoted the code, and you can see, and actually I guess I talked a little bit too long because now my IMSDBS pipeline triggered a Jenkins job, and what that did is run through a series of tests to retrieve code, retrieve tests, and in this case I'm running tests in a functional environment now. So now I'm no longer using data stubs, I'm connecting to live environments. And one of the things that you need to have in terms of iterating quickly is you need automation and integration with things like Jenkins. And during the year, one of the things that we've released within this year is the ability to drive JCL. So you can see here I have a stage within my pipeline that is using FileAid, and that's what I'm doing with FileAid is I'm automating the rebuild of my test environment. So every time I'm running through my functional tests, I know I'm running from a clean state and I'm not potentially using data that was out of date. I'm able to rerun the same types of transactions and get a repeatable automated scenario that gives me confidence that that code, as it goes through this pipeline, it runs through the test data, it executes a test, it collects code coverage metrics, and checks against SonarQube that it was done in a way that was quality. And I have confidence that the changes that I'm making, the changes that I'm promoting up, can be of quality. And another, in the last aspect that I'll touch on today, that we did add to Topaz Workbench is we've always had Jez Explorer. But one of the challenges around JES Explorer that it could be a little difficult for people to understand that when they click on jobs, there are underlying DDs. So in this case, you can see here that I have different jobs that were run. Some of these were run as part of my pipeline, and I can see the underlying DDs. If I want to go in and be able to see the actual report that was run from my jobs that were executed during my test phase, I'm able to get at that very quickly. I can get at the underlying DDs. I have very nice visual indications that this job ran successfully. So again, the workflow in the ease of use for the developers and giving them something that's easy to understand for both experienced mainframe pros and also new people to the platform really helps build that solid development experience. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jim to talk about one of the other things that we've done during during the year in terms of Topaz.
All right, thanks, Steve. That was kind of a fast and furious demo there, and I think what we can see, particularly from the questions, is that we're kind of moving along at a rapid clip, but some of the questions were much more fundamental to Topaz itself. And one thing, we'll get back to as many of the questions as we can handle. We really got flooded, but one thing there is that Google is your friend. So if you Google out on the internet, there are some YouTube videos that cover Topaz at a much more fundamental level. So some of these questions will get answered with those YouTube videos that tend to be very short. And it also brings a good point that we want to touch on now, is that how do you measure your maturity level in Topaz, right? We were kind of, what Steve showed you was the absolute highest degree of maturity within Topaz, using the runtime visualizer, using the data tools, using our new team profiles. Well, that isn't where you start. You kind of start at the beginning where you access DB2 tables through File A Data Editor and run Expediter debug sessions. And what we provide is a tool to help you measure where you are at that maturity level so you can begin to work on steps to improve it. And it's known as Z-Advisor. And really, Compuware has long provided something that we called the VIP data that was really specific to measuring the usage of our tools. And it was really useful at sites to identify training opportunities. So if we saw at a site that they weren't really using Expediter CICS to its utmost degree, we could offer some training to help the developers get better at Expediter CICS. Recently, we extended this capability to focus on DevOps KPIs built specifically around improving developers' productivity, and that's what this Z-Advisor is designed to do. And we can we're currently concentrating on about a dozen KPIs, like mean time to recovery when a failure occurs, the change rate of programs, the kind of information that we're showing in this graphic. And this Z-Advisor is actually free to existing Compuware customers, and the data can actually even be streamed to reduce the amount of work required on your end to get the benefit of this type of analysis. And again, like I said, Steve kind of really worked through that quick. We had a lot we wanted to show you, right? This is our brand new bouncing baby that we wanted to show off. But I just wanted to cover, the last webcast we gave on Topaz was about a year ago. So I just wanted to cover the highlights of what we've covered since that last year. And really, I wanted to break it down into those same 4 quadrants that we touched on that we wanted to bake into the DNA. And actually, Steve covered all of these. One is the essential, what are absolutely needed by programmers to accomplish their tasks. And Steve touched on JES Explorer, and that was really a learning experience for us. We came out with a release of JES Explorer, and we found out that customers weren't happy with it. So we kind of had to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and come out with a better user experience. Steve touched on data tools. Steve used team profiles in the community aspect to download that WEPay setup so he could jumpstart into productivity. He talked about how we've improved mainframe projects. Actually, I don't think he touched on ISPW projects, but we also added the capability of creating ISPW projects. And then this one is another one where, this was another lessons learned. We changed Expediter clips so out of the box it works regardless of whether your COBOL programs are 4.2 or COBOL 6. And then finally in the bridging, and this is kind of constant, we're constantly addressing our APIs to expose Topaz capabilities to our customers, and then also introducing them as CLIs to better integrate with automation tools like Jenkins. And Steve actually used our new Submit Jobs CLI in his automated pipeline. Phew. Okay, so that's it for our presentation. But before we get to questions, I just want to remind you that we're ready, willing, and able to give you a $50 gift card, but you cannot win if you do not play. So we would really ask that you fill out the survey, and that'll make you eligible for the drawing. The next thing, before we get to questions, I would just like to remind you of some assets that are available. In 2 short weeks, Steve is actually giving another presentation along with a person from CollabNet and a consultant from a company called Icon on how to expose your DevOps analysis in your mainframe work in your DevOps toolchain. So that kind of touches on automation and exposing the value stream part of the mainframe within CollabNet. And then secondly, one thing we offer is if your organization is just starting on their DevOps journey or even just thinking about starting or you're so far along, we do offer a guide to help you identify where you are in the journey and also some logical next steps on how you might proceed through that journey. And then finally, we'd love to hear from you. We're available on all social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it, we're there. We'd love to have you participate in those conversations. And you can also just contact us through that Contact Me link there. And I think with that, we can start covering as many of the questions as we can possibly get to in the time allotted. We did get a lot of questions kind of about Expediter and generally handling preprocessors. And one thing we didn't touch on is that really at the end of the day, Topaz is an IDE that's a front end to our traditional legacy products on the back end. So it's not, you request to look at a VSAM file, for instance, and we communicate through our interface called the HCI. We talk to FileAid on the back end, and we bring up an editor that's editing or browsing that VSAM file. And that's also true with Expediter. So really, as a general rule, if you can do it with the traditional product, you can do it within Eclipse. So we handle preprocessors and that type of work. Now, one thing you notice is that the experience quickly goes beyond that inside Topaz. For instance, with the runtime visualizer that Steve was showing you, where we actually keep track of the program calls, the database calls, the file I/O, so you can analyze what's happening under the covers of your application. That's really only available within Topaz. Steve, I'm going to catch my breath. Do you have a question you could answer?
Sure. So there's a couple questions I'll touch on. So one question was, how can we export Topaz Workbench configuration so that my application team can just import it with a team profile? And that's exactly the scenario that I was showing in the demo, where I had a configuration that was exported out of Topaz Workbench, and then I was able to import that. And the key things that you can import is you can import all of your Eclipse preferences. You can import configuration items such as host Explorer filters, debug configurations, file a data editor requests. You can export all of those. You can export projects, and again, to touch on, I did show briefly ISPW projects, total test projects, and also projects that can incorporate data. So you can export all of those aspects along with working sets that are filters essentially for the different information in your Project Explorer. So all that configuration is exportable. There's another question of how were test cases built up for automated testing, and this is an aspect that honestly I meant to show, but I guess it had slipped my mind during the demo. But when you're in that expediter debug session, when you're at a breakpoint, you have an option to generate a unit test, and then as you debug through that application, in the background, Total Test is capturing the information from the running program, and it uses that to generate a unit test. And that unit test contains the data stubs and the other aspects that it uses to run that application back, feeding in the same data. You can expand on the data, so you can add additional test cases as you go. But that's the process that you can go through to build up the automated testing. Another key thing that there's a question on, how about a CI/CS module and unit testing using Total Test? And this is a great question. So Total Test released the first support for CI/CS unit testing in our January release. So that's something that, in terms of Total Test, we've been continually building up the environmental support for Total Test, starting with vSAM files, for example, adding in DB2 support, adding in IMS support, and now we're in the process of adding in the CI/CS support. So we're covering the main subsystems in different types of data stores that your application can access with Total Test. Jim, this is maybe a good question for you to answer. Does the Explorer work with IMS DBs as well?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. And I think we can answer another question in the kind of the same category as someone asked about what's needed on the back end for the front end support. And really, once you understand how it works, it kind of becomes self-explanatory. So if you want to look at IMS databases through Topaz, you can do that, but really in the back end, it's talking to FileAid IMS. So as long as you have FileAid IMS, we can help edit and browse IMS databases. And same with DB2 tables. Steve showed you editing the DB2 tables. Well, on the back end, we were talking to FileAid DB2. And so that's kind of the setup. And then the other thing that I think we should touch on is that we were running the most current release of everything. So some of the functionality that we're running, because we're using our 19.3.1 release, if you're already a Topaz site and you're running, 18.3.2, you really need to get current to have absolutely everything we were showing you.
Jim, I'm going to answer another question. Is there a way to use the testing feature of the tool for overnight batch testing? So yes, that is definitely possible, and there's a couple different ways you could do that, but one of the things that we think is a best practice is to leverage something like Jenkins. And within Jenkins, we have a variety of different plugins. We have 6 different plugins with our latest being the JCL plugin that I talked about in the webcast. But one of those plugins is also a plugin for total test. So you could set up a Jenkins job that calls back to total test, and this is part of the pipeline that I showed was also running total test. And you could set that up on a scheduled basis to happen every night. That's actually something that internally for Compuware, as we develop our products, we have continuous integration, but we also have overnight testing of our products for running longer running test cases and a more thorough regression than what our continuous integration does.
I think maybe with that we should call it a day. We didn't get, I'd like to thank you for all these questions. I can't even count how many we got, but and we'll answer them all offline, but we want to be cognizant of the time. And to tell you the truth, we were thinking this would be a 30-minute WebEx, and here we are staring at an hour. So I think with that, we'd like to thank you for your time, and we hope you found this interesting.
Thank you.